I've had thousands of conversations with priests, ministers, brothers and sisters of the clergy, but I've only specifically ever asked to have one of them. I was raised a Catholic, attending catechism, receiving the sacraments of communion and confirmation. I attended a Catholic high school and not one, but two Catholic universities. But for the past 22 years, I've been a UU, a Unitarian Universalist. If you do a Google search on UU, one of the first things that pops up is the question, do Unitarian Universalists believe in God? My husband, Craig, and I, we were married by a UU minister in 1995 at a small bed and breakfast in Evanston. That's the city that shares its southern border with Chicago, where Craig and I live. Craig and I have been married for 28 years, 6 months, and 15 days. Every day counts. For the past 4 years, I've been Craig's caregiver. In late February of 2020, Craig's defibrillator went off 75 times. I like to say he had one phone call in him and he made the right one to 911 before collapsing on our dining room floor. When no one answered the door, just like in the movies, the EMTs entered through the window. Now, I didn't see this happen. I was at work. But when I came home that night after the hospital, I found Craig's cell phone on the kitchen counter, the hallway rug rolled up, and the screen from the front window lying on the living room floor. Our next door neighbor, Janice, she had seen the ambulance arrived around 11 o'clock that morning, and she sent me a text. Is everything okay? Thank God. Otherwise, I would have arrived home from work and wondered what the hell happened. Craig was kept in a sedated coma for 3 days. When he woke, we discovered he'd lost about 60% of his short-term memory. He stayed in hospital for 3 weeks and was discharged on the day Illinois' governor shut down the state due to COVID-19. We were sent home with several monitoring devices and under a 21-day quarantine. The next 3 months were the most frightening of my life because Craig couldn't participate in any decision-making. He was barely tracking the pandemic raging outside our home. We tried to take walks, but Craig had to stop every 10 feet to rest. In June of that year, Craig's blood pressure dropped to 65/29. I rushed him to the hospital where he was later admitted. Craig needed a new heart and began the transplant evaluation immediately. I knew that biopsy was a bad idea. I look back on that moment and I realize that is the precise moment that taught me to never again ignore my instincts. I remind you, Craig had lost a big part of his memory, so I used the whiteboard in his hospital room to show him what his options were. I needed him to understand and be part of this decision. I couldn't make it alone. Option 1, a non-invasive procedure that required a special isotope that unfortunately was caught up in the supply chain disruption. So Craig would be sent home until it arrived. Or option 2, Craig could have an invasive biopsy the next day. We were both too frightened to go home. He chose number 2. I was alerted almost immediately. Craig had crashed during the biopsy, and I had been placed on life support. I was told to come to the hospital when he had been settled into ICU in 6 hours. When I arrived with my friend Susan, we were led into Craig's room. 2 big machines, a ventilator and an ECMO blocked Craig lying in the bed. Craig and I squeezed in well, I am not kidding, I counted 11 doctors, nurses, technicians, counselors, and clergy filed into the room to explain that Craig's options for survival were pretty good if I decided he should receive an LVAD, a left ventricular assisted device, or a heart pump. I agreed. After the doctors cleared the room, I sat at Craig's bedside and laid my forehead on his mattress and placed his hand on the back of my head. I soaked his bedding with my tears and I wailed like a character from a Greek tragedy. I surrendered. My heart spoke to his and I asked if I had made the decision he wanted. My heart told his that only he knew what it was going to take to get through this, and if he didn't want to, I gave him permission to let go. But if he was up for the fight, so was I. Though no words were spoken, I clearly heard Craig say, "Hell no, I won't go." It's right here in July of 2020 when I asked to talk to my senior minister at my church. It was the 3rd day Craig had been on life support. I asked Reverend Eileen, what did she see as the difference between faith and hope? For the past 3 days, I had been praying to God, to my childhood God, who I no longer believed in, the one I was taught would never give me more than I could handle. No God, ergo, all sorts of evil shit can hail down on you. The summer that followed Craig's surgery, I spent many hours alone in our yard. A vaccine for COVID-19 was still months away. I was on my knees for hours, planting 100 daffodil, hyacinth, and tulip bulbs. I watered each of them with my tears of grief and joy. Craig's recovery, it was really rough, but he came home on our 25th wedding anniversary, 4 months after being admitted. Since my conversation with Reverend Eileen, I still turn over this question. What is the difference between faith and hope? Well, for me, hope feels like a string, a magic string that I would pull to unravel the mess and make everything turn out okay. Whereas faith was knowing that no matter how tangled the mess might be, I would be okay. I'd hoped for this day, when Craig and I are now preparing for our 30th wedding anniversary, just 17 months and 15 days away. And today, here in Chicago, the tulips are in bloom, and I have faith.